Okay, so good evening and welcome to our webinar this evening, our Sustainability in Surgery webinar. And we're going to be looking and talking and listening to new information about disposable versus reusable items in surgery. I will introduce our speakers this evening and our panel members in a second, but I just wanted to explain a little bit about why we have held this webinar, which is quite exciting. We did another webinar on a similar subject a couple of months ago, and we were inundated with questions and attendees, and then people watching again the webinar later. And there was obviously demand to go into this a bit more, and we've had hundreds of people sign up to this evening. So it's quite exciting. There's obviously an appetite to learn more about this and hear about what's going on currently. So we are lucky enough to have two speakers this evening. So Ms. Chantal Rezan, who is one of the Royal College of Surgeons Fellows, Research Fellows, and also Prof. Mood Butter as well, who's an ENT surgeon in Brighton, but I'll let them both introduce themselves with all their accolades when they speak to us a bit more this evening. And we've got myself, who is a member of the Royal College Council, and Richard Kerr, and we are all four of us on the Sustainability in Surgery Working Group Committee at the Royal College of Surgeons of England, which actually has brought about all these webinars at the Royal College. And recently, actually just a couple of days ago, we released our Sustainability in Surgery strategy. And this has been it's been a long time coming, and it's actually very exciting. It does outline how we hope to embed financial, environmental and social sustainability with ethical purchasing into everything that we do. We're also working on guidance to support this work and to help our industry to meet net carbon zero carbon by 2045. So that would be in line with the greener NHS strategy. And because climate change, everyone's talking about it, and we really need to be at the forefront of this in surgery, because we have such a huge carbon footprint in surgery. When you look at how much we contribute to the NHS, we're one of the worst offenders, and we really need to make big changes to try and deal with this. And so this is why we're holding these webinars. We're going to be trying to produce guidance as well. And operating theatres really are really responsible for this, and therefore industry as well. So I'm very grateful to our two speakers this evening that will be telling us a little bit more about this. And then we can answer as many questions as we can at the end, and we'll keep them coming as they're coming through live, and questions we've already had sent through as well. So without further ado, we'll start off with Chantal, Ms. Rezan, to start her talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Vic. So my name is Chantal, and I'm currently undertaking a PhD at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, where I'm looking at ways to reduce the environmental impacts of the operating theatre. Now, as Vic said, in our last webinar, we had lots of questions which arose with regards to single-use versus reusable items. So today we wanted to do a deep dive into this issue. We're going to start off by just examining where this sits in relation to the wider issues, and then go on to talk about the evidence supporting reusable versus disposables, both in terms of the environmental impact and also the financial cost. And then Prof. Bitter will go on to talk about some of those opportunities and the system barriers to switching to reusables from disposables. And just to make you aware at this stage, the research presented here specifically on hybrid laparoscopic instruments was actually funded by Surgical Innovations, who manufacture hybrid laparoscopic instruments, but the company played no part in the scientific conduct, analysis or writing of the manuscript, and didn't have any involvement in this presentation. Next slide, please. So we're going to take a step back now and just contextualize this. This is a graphic that you might recognize from some of the other talks. Just to remind you then, the very biggest thing that we can do to actually reduce our environmental impact of our surgical services that we provide as a whole is actually focusing on surgical disease prevention to minimize the need for surgery in the first place. We then need to be engaging with our patients. Go back a slide, please. To actually improve their health as part of their preoperative optimization, and also to reduce the complication rates, and go on then to look at our whole patient pathways and to use lean management techniques to streamline those, for example, through use of virtual clinics where appropriate. And it's only then that we should focus on low carbon treatment options, as well as low carbon actual equipment. And for example, that includes the single use versus reusable debate, as well as circular economy principles such as maintenance, repair and recycling. So we're going to spend the rest of this evening's session actually focusing on just those last two bits of the pyramid and really focus on the surgical equipment itself. Next slide, please. So just to put this then in context with the carbon footprint of a whole healthcare system, so looking at the NHS carbon footprint, this equates to around 25 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents each year. That's around 4% of all of the greenhouse gases produced in England. And actually the medical equipment, next click please, is responsible for around 10%, sorry, just go back a slide please, it should have just come up with a little red circle around the 10%. But essentially the medical equipment is responsible for 10%, and a lot of the principles that we'll be discussing this evening then have overlap with the non-medical equipment as well as other supply chain issues. And so it's going to be really important that we apply some of these principles we'll discuss in order to meet net zero carbon by 2045 in line with the Greener NHS targets. Next slide, please. So as Vic mentioned, this is a particular problem for surgery because we're such a resource intensive area. This slide then shows the carbon footprint of all the equipment that we use for just a single operation, focusing here on a tonsillectomy. And here we found that actually the reusable instrument set was responsible for around 16% of the carbon footprint, and that was largely due to the sterilisation process. But actually the lion's share was in relation to the production of the single-use items as well as their packaging. And I went on to do some hotspot analysis to identify that actually a third of the whole carbon footprint of the equipment that we were using were attributable to just a small number of large, bulky, single-use, predominantly plastic items. And here this was the suction tubing, the table drape, the sterile gloves, as well as the patient drape. Next slide, please. So this slide now shows some images of some other large, bulky, single-use items that I came across within my research. And you can see here that this includes things like electrosurgical items such as diathermies, as well as suction irrigation and infusion bags. And there are some single-use laparoscopic pieces of equipment there, as well as single-use gowns, drapes, and orthopedic hoods, for example. So we really do need to be targeting these large, single-use, bulky plastic items. Next slide, please. So we're all aware that in each and every operation, there's a large volume of waste that's produced, and of course, this is mainly single-use items. Looking at a single adeno tonsillectomy operation, this was found to actually generate over 100 pieces of single-use plastic items. And this was also highlighted by the Sustainable Development Unit, the SDU, who looked across the whole of the things that we're using within the NHS and looked at those things that actually contribute the most in terms of their carbon emissions. And it specifically highlighted there that single-use surgical instruments are within our top 20 contributors. So we really do need to tackle this. I also conducted a systematic review looking at the carbon footprint of surgery and found that actually the consumables, as you might expect, were a carbon hotspot, and that was alongside our anaesthetic gases and electricity. But perhaps we're going to do less to change that. But certainly the pieces of equipment that we use are within our control. Next slide, please. So in thinking about this medical equipment and how we might actually reduce the environmental impact, I think it's very helpful to draw on circular economy principles. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we're currently using a very linear model whereby we actually we extract our resources and we use finite resources in the actual manufacturing process and the distribution. We use those items once or a very limited number of times before disposal. And of course, this is an unsustainable situation given the fact that we've got only a finite amount of resources on this earth. And really, we need to be shifting towards this circular economy whereby we actually maximise the active use of all of our products and also the component materials within them. And that might be achieved through designing reusable products that are really durable, and also perhaps having modular components which in and of themselves are then potentially repairable or upgradable. And we also need to reframe waste, where we see that actually as a valuable resource that can potentially be either repaired, remanufactured or recycled. And this also does actually have significant financial benefits as well. So the World Economic Forum estimated that we would actually save around $1 trillion by 2025 through material savings through using circular economy principles. Next slide, please. So we'll now think in terms of a hierarchy for how we might actually be able to reduce the environmental impact of the surgical equipment that we use. We'll be considering these each in turn and in order of importance. The top priority needs to be focusing on those areas that we can switch single-use items for reusables. But then if we think about the reusables themselves and how we can actually optimize those, that might be through repair processes as well as optimizing decontamination. Where it's not clinically appropriate to use a fully reusable item, there may be options also for hybrid items, which are predominantly reusable, but then with small single-use components. And finally, where we can't use reusables or hybrids, we should be exploring options to actually extend the lifespan of our single-use items through remanufacture or reprocessing. And where all else fails, we need to be looking at recycling. So next slide, please. So we'll now be thinking about the evidence in terms of the environmental impact of single-use versus reusables. The most robust method for this is what's called a life cycle assessment, or an LCA. And this is a method that essentially evaluates a range of environmental impacts across the whole product lifespan, and that covers the raw material extraction through the manufacturing phase, as well as distribution, the use phase, which for the reusables will be the sterilization process and linen laundering, through to the final disposal. And our existing evidence shows that actually there's strong evidence in favour of the reusables for a variety of items that are used within the operating theatre, and that includes the use of surgical scissors, as well as laryngoscopes, laryngeal mask airways, perioperative linens, which within that systematic review they looked at surgical gowns as well as drapes. There's also a study looking at laparotomy pads and reusable sharps containers also. Next slide, please. But there is some conflicting evidence. There's some evidence that actually is suggesting that reusables are worse or similar, but the majority of those studies were conducted in Australia. And just bear in mind that these were using coal-based electricity for the sterilisation process, and where these studies actually remodeled their data using electricity that had a higher proportion of renewables, so using, for example, European or US electricity supplies, again, we saw that the reusables were better. There was also a paper that was published just a few months ago that was looking at spinal fusion surgery equipment, and that indicated that single use were better also. But on closer examination, if we think about the functional unit that they were comparing, on the bottom on the right there, you can see that on the left-hand side, there were a huge number of reusable kits that they were then comparing with just a few single-use items. So perhaps where we can truly switch a large number of reusables to just a few single-use items, then it may be that there are benefits. But I suspect there are very few instances where this is truly the case. Next slide, please. So we're going to look in a bit more detail now at a simple instrument. So focusing here on a Mayo straight surgical scissor. This is my own analysis comparing reusable scissors manufactured in Germany versus single-use scissors which were manufactured in Pakistan, as is quite common. And here I found that actually the carbon footprint of the single-use items was 13 times higher than the reusables. So 835 grams of CO2e per use versus 64 for the reusables. And I just want to draw your attention at this stage to the bar graph on the right hand side, and you can see the navy at the bottom shows that the major contributor for the reusables was the decontamination process. I also found that the financial cost was 3 times higher for the single-use items, and we'll be going on into more detail in terms of the life cycle cost analysis at a later stage in the presentation. Next slide, please. So I think it's helpful at this stage also just to think in terms of the number of uses of those reusables. And so I modelled a number of different use profiles. And what we could see here is that even with just 2 uses of the reusables, there were clear benefits as compared to the single use. There are additional benefits from additional uses, but that actually plateaus at around 40 uses. So we don't need to be using huge number of uses of these reusables in order to have a clear benefit over the single-use items. And at that point, so at the point where it plateaus, that's because there are other bottlenecks that come into play, which, as you saw in the previous graph, were actually the decontamination processes. Next slide, please. So I've looked at decontamination in more detail and looked at the alternative sterile barrier systems and things that we can do to optimize the decontamination process. And within this study, I found that actually use of reusable rigid containers such as the Ascalap tin that you can see on the top left has just a quarter of the carbon footprint compared with the blue polypropylene wrap that you'll typically see in theatres. And it was also associated with cost savings. So it costs just half the price per use. And given that these are manufactured to the same sterility assurance standards, there's really no particular reason why we shouldn't be using more of these reusable rigid containers. So the second thing that we found that you can do to optimize the decontamination process is to be decontaminating things as part of sets. And here I found that actually preparing items as individually wrapped items in the flexible polyethylene pouches conferred a 3 times greater carbon footprint compared with using sets. And that's partly because of the pouches, but also because of the way that the decontamination machines are loaded. So where you've got a slot that's filled with individually wrapped supplementary items, typically there are far fewer items than when you've got a whole set. So the final thing that we need to do is to improve the efficiency of the machine loading within our sterilisation services departments. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we can do in terms of actually optimizing our reusables and reducing their environmental impact further is to actually consider repair. If we think about repairing surgical scissors, this can actually double the lifespan of those scissors and it can be repeated up to 9 times. So in terms of what's required for 400 uses of surgical scissors, we could either have 1 pair of scissors that's then replaced with 9 new sets of reusable scissors, or we could actually repair those scissors 9 times. And within this analysis, I found that actually the carbon footprint of those that are repaired was actually, it reduced the carbon footprint by around 1/5, as well as reducing the cost per use by around 1/3. And commonly repaired surgical instruments include surgical scissors, osteotomes, needle holders, retractors, as well as clamps. And whilst instruments are most commonly repaired off-site, there are a couple of trusts in the UK that actually do on-site repair, and there are additional benefits of on-site repair compared to off-site in that they actually have faster turnaround times. They're typically the instruments are typically returned in just a few days as opposed to around a month. But these repair services are often underutilised, so I really would urge you to ask your theatre staff to send damaged instruments for repair rather than just discarding these. And we also need better active maintenance as well as the repair. Next slide, please. So we're going to touch now on single-use versus reusable PPE, as some of you have been asking about this. This is a life cycle assessment that I recently published evaluating the environmental impacts of the PPE that we've used in health and social care in England during the first 6 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. There were 3 billion items of predominantly single-use PPE that we used during that time period. And on the left-hand side, you can see that the total carbon footprint over this 6-month period amounted to over 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. And that equates to flying from London to New York around 244 times each and every single day. I found that gloves were the biggest contributor here, followed by aprons, face shields and masks. But on the right-hand side, importantly, you can then see that by adopting a range of strategies, it was possible to actually reduce and mitigate that environmental impact by up to 75%. And that included strategies such as using domestic manufacture of PPE within the UK, as well as rationalising our glove use and switching to reusables where possible. And here that was modelled using the reusable gowns that we use in theatres, as well as reuse of facials with a disinfectant wipe, and finally also recycling. Next slide, please. So where it's not possible or clinically it's inappropriate to actually use reusables, we need to explore hybrid options, which are also referred to as disposable instruments. And these are items that are predominantly reusable, but with a small single-use component. So, for example, within the context of a laparoscopy, this might include reusable tray cars and ports, which then have a disposable seal, or reusable instrument handles, which then have a disposable insert. So I conducted a life cycle assessment comparing hybrid laparoscopic instruments to single-use equivalents. As I mentioned, that LCA was funded by Surgical Innovations. And here I found that the carbon footprint of the hybrid clip applier was just 17% of the single-use equivalent. The laparoscopic scissors in the middle, that was around 1/3 of the carbon footprint of the single-use equivalents, and for ports it was around 27%. I projected also that if these 3 hybrid products were then used across all lap colis in England, this would actually save the equivalent of driving over 1 million miles in an average petrol car. And there were also financial savings of around 11 million. I'll go into detail in terms of the financial breakdown but later on in the presentation. And there were also significant reductions in terms of the plastic and the waste that were generated. Next slide, please. So if we get to the point where we haven't been able to switch to reusables, and there's also no options for using hybrids, and we're really stuck with using single use, we do then need to consider reprocessing, which is also known as remanufacturing. And this is where we have single use medical devices which are prepared for another single use. And it's more typically used for quite complex items such as endoscopic and electrosurgical devices. And that process in and of itself involves essentially reverse engineering, some cleaning and decontamination, testing of the materials and the performance of those materials, as well as things like the electrical integrity, and then they're repackaged and sterilised according to industry standards. And again, there have been LCA studies demonstrating the environmental benefits of this reprocessing, and this was shown across a range of medical devices in that first paper that you see there, where they looked at endoscopic trocars, DVT compression devices, pulse oximeters, amongst a number of other items. And the second study focused then on electrophysiology catheters that are used in cardiac ablations. The graphic that you can see on the right actually shows that the remanufactured items had around half the carbon footprint compared to the single-use equivalent. Next slide, please. So the final thing that we need to do where all else fails is to consider recycling. Just to remind you, there's around a 50-fold difference in terms of the carbon footprint of the waste itself for recycling versus sending things for high temperature incineration. But waste itself is responsible for less than 5% of the carbon footprint of the NHS. So recycling maximally is only going to make a small difference in terms of us actually reaching net zero. And in terms of recycling, the benefit from the reduced need for virgin materials acquisition is actually assigned to the user of those recycled materials. And for healthcare products, when we talk about recycling, these are typically then used within the construction industry or within lower grade products. So in order for healthcare to truly benefit from recycling, we're going to have to see an increase in terms of the recycled content of the materials that we actually use. So we need to start then by increasing the recycled content of non-critical, non-sterile items where there'll be the least resistance in terms of the safety and the regulations. For example, in things like aprons, operating theatres and drug trays, for example. Next slide, please. So we're going to just finish off now by thinking in more detail about the financial side of things. A number of you wrote in with some questions around this. So I did a breakdown in terms of the full life cycle cost of a couple of the slides that you saw earlier. And here, focusing firstly on the surgical scissors, we found that a single use of the single-use scissors cost around 3 times more than the reusables. So you can see at the bottom there, that was around £4.26 per item versus just £1.43 for the reusables. And there were further reductions down to around £1 where repair was additionally used. And we had a query about the cost of decontamination in relation to procurement of new items. And within this study, we found that actually the cost of sterilisation itself was around 1/5 of the cost. So really very significantly lower compared to actually buying a new pair of scissors. Next slide, please. So then thinking about a slightly more complex item, so back to those laparoscopic pieces of equipment. I found that across all 3 hybrid items, there were significant cost savings compared with the single use. And these range from around 1/3 of the cost to up to 80% of the cost compared with the single use items. So these are, of course, more expensive single use items, but despite being larger than the scissors, the cost of the decontamination actually just remained just a fraction of the cost of buying the new single-use items. So I think there were perhaps some misconceptions around this in terms of the cost of sterilisation and so on, but the evidence does really suggest that in general the environmentally preferable option is actually also financially more cost-effective as well, and it's convenient that the two do generally go hand in hand. Next slide, please. So just to summarise then, in order to actually reduce the environmental impact of the surgical equipment that we use, we certainly need to be focusing on switching to reusables. Once we have reusables in place, we can think about optimising our decontamination processes as well as using repair to extend the lifespan of our reusables. And where reusables are unfeasible, it's also then possible to consider hybrid items which are predominantly reusable, and where that then fails and we're stuck with single use, we need to be exploring options for remanufacture and reprocessing. And finally, where all else fails, then we need to be looking at recycling. So now I'll pass you over to Mood, who'll be discussing the opportunities and some of those barriers to actually switching from single use to reusables.
Thanks very much, Chantel. It's great to see that there's so many people on this webinar, and it's great to see the enthusiasm for this topic. So I just wanted to start with saying that. So I'm also at Brighton and Sussex Medical School and Brighton and Sussex Hospitals, and I've had an interest in sustainability for some time, and very happy to be here. So what I was going to talk about really is trying to understand how did we get to this stage. I think it's clear, I hope, from Chantel's presentation that the reusable versus disposable debate is very, very strongly in favour of reusable. So if anybody asks that question, you'd have to say the reverse. You have to show to me why your disposable product is better than the reusable. Now, there may be some certain products where there are safety, but the idea that, oh no, that linear model is the correct one is a simple thing that we really need to take away from this, and that we as surgeons need to take forward. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about perhaps how we've got here and how we got to this linear model to be honest, we're using this linear model throughout much of our work, throughout much of our lives, and this also applies to surgery. So I'm going to take you back to the late 1980s and early 1990s. There are a lot of things that were wrong in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as you can see here. But one of the things that was also wrong was the way that we were perhaps taking sterilization and safety. So next slide, please. So if you look at the literature from that time, what we find that there was inconsistent or inadequate sterilization occurring. And actually, there's some papers that have reported that. So, for example, surveys that have been done of GPs practices that were sterilizing using autoclaves, some of them had no idea how often they were supposed to test the machine. Some of them weren't aware of the processes and the protocols. Some of them were not aware that you need to actually, for example, clean a surgical instrument before you put it in the autoclave, thoroughly clean it, because blood left on it is not good. The same was found in some dental practices. So there was an inconsistent practice, and that was perhaps a lack of knowledge, perhaps a lack of time as well. We also had some sterilization processes which we don't really use anymore. For example, ethanol and formaldehyde were shown to be inadequate for certain proteins, including, for example, prions, which I'm going to come on to talk about in a moment. And that led to this concern that actually these things were not going right. They were not being done the right way. Now, if you marry that with poor tracking and accountability, so what that means is, yes, we had these uncertain processes and perhaps inconsistent and inadequate processes in sometimes going on, and that was married with a failure to understand where that was happening and what instruments may have been affected. So there were reports of cross-contamination. So, for example, if there is a set of instruments, those instruments will be mixed with another set of instruments before going into sterilization. And that's obviously not good, because that makes it very difficult to trace. And when you've got certain high-risk things, such as prions, as I'm going to come on to talk about, that does present a risk. We also know, and this is data from the US as well as from around the world, actually, breaches were difficult to trace. So if something happened and there was an error, how can you find that out? Because there was an inadequate recording and there was not a clear trace. So if an instrument was contaminated, for example, a surgical instrument, it'd be impossible to find out what operation that had been used on which patients, where the fault lies. And so those together were the sort of if you like, the conditions that we were dealing with. And then what happened, for those of us who are young enough to remember, and some of us well, old enough, I should say, to remember, young in the 80s and 90s, I remember new variant CJD coming in. So this was new variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which was a prion disease. So pretty sure that it's caused by a protein. And you know, for those who lived through that will remember this very well, with all the images of the so-called mad cows developing this incurable disorder, and indeed we're seeing human disease. So we were that I think really was a precipitate of this sort of concern that this was a real infection risk, because we had this prion, this potential protein that existed on certain instruments. We were not consistently or adequately sterilizing them. We had poor tracking about accountability, huge potential infection risk that we didn't know how to deal with. So that was what precipitated some of these problems. But also we had issues with inconsistent quality of instruments, inconsistent repair of instruments. So repair centers used to exist within a lot of the big hospitals. So they'd be repaired on site, but that was quite variable. And some were repaired off site. And sometimes surgeons would send it off site and they'd never see that instrument again. Or they might see it 6 weeks later. Well, not much good if you need the instrument for the operation. And there's problems with maintenance. So Tom Brophy, who's been a real pioneer really in surgical instrument repair from BART, has shown that around 15% of instruments fail to comply with quality standards when examined under a microscope. These were instruments that are in use. And there's also reports on the National Reporting Service of around 260 incidents a year due to instrument failure. That's bits falling off, things not working as the way they should. So this is a problem. But again, if this is married with the issue of tracking and accountability, it means that we have no way of actually dealing with this issue. So instruments are not tracked. You buy an instrument, and at the moment, we don't know where that product has come from. So these things together mean that there were concerns about cost an inconvenience. If you've got an instrument that you send off to repair but actually it disappears, then obviously there's a cost associated with it. There's an inconvenience associated with that. So altogether, we had these issues really of poor systems that led to the circular economy that we want for surgical instruments, for example, not being really a viable issue. And then we had this emergency of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, of new variant CJD, that really made us question this circular model and this uncertainty about the risks that we were propagating. So instead, the alternative was this linear model that Chantal's already spoken about, where we say, okay, let's just buy, use, throw away. There is no risk, as far as we can tell, to the patient of acquiring anything. And once we started that model, I think we developed that model further. So the linear model became perpetuated, and some of those factors include a disproportionate or hypothetical concerns about infection risk. So it was valid to have concerns about prion disease transmission, and in fact there were electrosurgical needles used in neurosurgery, Richard will probably speak to this more than I can, that were actually sterilized with formaldehyde and ethanol and had been shown to transmit the prion. But actually the subsequent data shows it's probably fine. If you sterilize using modern processes, you're probably not going to transmit anything. And also there's hardly any prion disease around now in the UK. But that disproportionate hypothetical concern set, I think, this mindset that actually there is infection risk everywhere. Of course there is. I mean, if I eat off of someone else's spoons and plates, there's an infection risk. There's infection on all surfaces, but we've perhaps gone a bit too far. And then we have these capitalist models. Let's be honest, the capitalist model is built on the linear economy. It is buy and sell, buy and sell, buy and sell. So of course, companies grew that developed this model of linear model, which is what's been promoted. And there's no company that's going to say, actually, you know what, we'd rather sell you something that's we're not going to be able to sell you again. That company would go out of business. Next, please. And then perhaps once we've created this or supported the development of these linear models, obviously we have circular models for other things, we have a lack of alternative products or systems because that's the models we've created. So if you want to change, it's a Herculean task to get over. Of course, what we need now is to change and go back to so-called good old days. So what are the building blocks for change? We need, I think, an intelligent approach to infection risk. Yes, certain things, such as using an IV cannula, yes, we should not use that again. That is a high risk to patients. But for other things, for example, some people will say, oh, you reuse a metal tongue depressor, which of course is ridiculous because we reuse a spoon in a canteen with far less sterilization, of course. So we need, I think, really to build an evidence base for that infection risk and not have a binary assessment. Either it's risk or it's not risk. It's actually that is very low risk. It's a hypothetical risk. Let's be sensible. Let's say that's okay. And I think what I would encourage is if someone has the will to take that forward, that's a real big piece of work that needs to be done. I'm trying to get those sorts of discussions going at a national level, but I think the more of us that really push for that, that's really going to change this infection control to something more sensible. We need products that are designed for reuse and longevity. Okay, and this is a call to those who may be from industry, either listening to this live or listening to this sequentially, to say this really is, I've been asked to co-chair the commission, if you like, the report that will come out on sustainable surgery. And I'm just going to give you some insider market information for free. We will be very clearly stating that wherever possible, products need to be reusable. So the future company will be the one that is thinking, how do I make a good quality reusable products? I can also tell you, I was asked just last week by a leading supplier to the NHS if I would happily speak at one of their webinars on sustainability. And of course, I'm happy to engage with industry. And then they asked me if I would mind not talking about the reuse debate. Of course, I've now declined. So this is the way forward, and this is what the industry needs to do. And I'm afraid, certainly from the UK perspective, I think people on this call will be pushing for that model of reuse to be the future. We need quality standards for sterilization to get around that risk. Actually, we have those quality standards. The quality standards that exist now are very clear. There's a health technical memorandum. There's clear guidelines. I've been to our sterile services department It is state of the art. I have no concerns that the standards they approach. Of course, we need further training and support, but they scrub the instruments with detergents as required. They go through automated processes. Those machines are checked to check that they're up to standard. They are fit for purpose. What else? Next, please. So we do need tracking and tracing of instruments and products. Again, it's part of that risk assessment. If we're going to say there's an infection risk, actually, if we can control that risk, we can say, okay, we can control that risk, and that risk is probably minuscule, but even if it materializes, we've got a way to deal with it. So we need tracking and tracing of instruments and products, and that has happened obviously at a local set level now. Your hospitals will trace those trays, will be able to account for where they're used, and there's discussions at a national level, which have happened for some time, for every new instrument that's coming in to be labelled and tracked and traced. We need local and regional centres for sterilisation and repair. Hopefully it can happen within the hospital, but even if it can't happen in your hospital, it's still, as Chantal has shown, better to do it somewhere local, to transport it there and to sterilise it and bring it back. That's still much better, both financially and in terms of carbon footprint. So we need to build those centres for repair and sterilisation wherever feasible. And we need interdisciplinary work. This is not just surgical, it is also anesthetics. And I think we could talk about laryngoscope blades as well, other disposable items that link in. We could also talk about emergency surgery. A lot of surgery happens in A&E departments where you've got suturing under local anesthetic. And the vast majority of A&E departments where I've worked were using single-use disposable instruments. And that is because the wrong systems have been set up. Those systems that they're using can just be brought into a hospital sterilisation system. So we don't need these compartmentalised working for emergency in A&E surgery. We just bring that into what we've already got as existing structures within the hospital, either locally or regionally. And the one thing I left up here is this will be a call to the politicians to stop these short-term financial cycles as well, because we need to invest, and we don't need to say, oh, I've got to make the budget meet by April, let's just buy something I can throw away, rather than invest in something that is the building blocks for our future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So Mood, Chantal, very challenging. Thank you for those fascinating presentations. I might kick off, if I may, just to get the ball rolling as regards questions, and just take us back, Mood, as you did to the 80s and 90s, about the changes that happened at that time and whether they were appropriate. So the CJD issue clearly drove a lot as regards to the instrumentation, particularly in those disciplines where you may expose the instruments to virological tissues. At the same time, there was, I think if you remember, the issue about the MRSA, which was really taking hold. And so we began to, not only did the instruments change because of CJD, but we began to move away from reusable gowns and drapes, which up to that point we had all used, and I would say preferred to use. So we had the bevo, the elbow bit, and all of that, and it was about infection control. And as you said, I think it was to do with the concerns about contamination in reusable drapes and gowns. So I guess my question is, that seems to me to be an easy place to start, given that what Chantal suggested to us, that gowns and drapes actually account for a significant proportion of the concerns we have about single-use items. And yet, for us to move back to reusable gowns and drapes would be a relatively easy thing to do with the knowledge about decontamination. Now, we need some low-hanging fruit to begin to move the agenda on. Is that a place to start? Are there reasons why we shouldn't do that? I'll put that to both of you.
So, thank you, Richard. Yes, so I think it was an appropriate emergency response back when we had CJD, because there's no way we could make those systems fit for purpose within the timescale of a few weeks, which is what was required. So it's you know, we're still living through a similar pandemic. There's an emergency. What do? We take the precautionary principle. But the systems now are reliable, they're better. There are standards as well for linens that are already, I didn't put those down, but those exist. So for the laundering of linens,
Yeah.
so we can be assured that those systems are there. So I can tell you in my operating theatre, nobody is allowed to put on a disposable gown unless they tell me why. So I don't use disposable gowns. I don't use disposable drapes because I cannot see any argument for their use. There is no evidence that a disposable gown is more sterile than an appropriately laundered, linen, sterilized, reusable version. So we've got good systems. We should be using them. So you're absolutely right. That's a quick, easy win.
So that's a message to the surgeons watching this tonight, to ask for reusable gowns and drapes.
And further to that, I would just add that it's something that each and every individual can take on regardless of your grade, and I think it is a way of actually starting that conversation in theatre. So if you're perhaps a trainee opting for a reusable gown, or asking the question to those that are using single-use linens within the theatre setting, why they're doing this, and just starting that conversation. And the other thing that I have seen, which is just slightly perverse, is where there's actually a reusable drape that's then used for the patient, but for the sterile tray, that trolley drape is then single use, and there's absolutely no reason why reusable is good enough for the patient but not for the trolley drape. So we need to be, as you said, addressing those areas of quick and easy change, which really are not putting the patient at additional risk.
Yeah. So there's questions coming in thick and fast, and we'll begin to address some of those. This is one that was sent in right at the beginning for you, Chantal. Is there an easy way to look at carbon footprint for specific procedures? How would you start to do this?
I would say that there's no simple and easy way to carbon footprint a procedure. The good news is that there are clearly very transferable lessons that we can draw from the research that is out there, and a lot of the principles that we've discussed this evening are applicable regardless of the operation. And of course, specific procedures are going to have their own particular hotspots, but I would advise drawing on the existing literature that is out there. If you're interested in actually performing these sorts of studies themselves, I would recommend, for example, going on a carbon footprinting course, such as those that we provide at the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, and that will give you a solid foundation as a starting point as to how you might carbon footprint a procedure.
Okay, so a couple of questions really with the relationship with industry here, and either Jade or Chantal, whether you feel able to pick these up. What's the response of the industries that provide disposable equipment? And are they providing reusable choices or remanufacturing options to trust?
I think it's quite variable. There are some who seem genuinely on board with understanding what we need for the future. And then there are some companies, let's be honest, are greenwashing. There are companies that are producing disposable products that we really don't need, but they'll produce them using some solar panels. That's not the solution. There are some who are saying, oh, we use some recycled content. That is not the solution. It is a reusable, high quality product that we can use again and again and again. And that's really is a call to industry. I'm not, you know, sorry if it's a plethora of different varieties. There are good guys and there are people who are still a little bit behind. And obviously, you know, it's not, this is not against industry at all. We want to move to where we need to get to.
So that there's a further comment. There's a proliferation of companies, mainly from the US, coming into the UK with disposable endoscopic equipment for GI endoscopy, and are pushing very hard on the pretext of infection risk, particularly for duodenoscopes. So the issue is how do we try to counter that? And this came from someone who is working at Green Endoscopy, trying to counter this. How can we help?
Well, I think we do need to be placing the burden of evidence on those that are making those claims. In terms of infection risk, we do need to be quantifying that, of course, and where there is a genuine risk, taking that into account. But in the absence of evidence, I don't think that we can assume that there's any meaningful risk associated with the reusable equivalents.
So just moving on to the issue of infection control, which is clearly very important here. And one of the issues, and if we go back to the beginning of the CJD issue, is that in general terms, and perhaps correctly, the trusts and the health service are risk averse when it comes to any suspicion of infection. Now, I think your challenge, Mood, to have another look at this and to build the evidence very much requires also to consider that appetite for risk that the trust and the health service want to take. So a question that's come in around that is infection prevention control in each trust has quite a lot to say in guidelines and how they're interpreted. So how can we work on infection prevention control across the board to move these things forwards if we're going to bring rationalization and particularly move towards more reusables? How can we rationalize that infection control argument?
So I think that is a critical question that I've been asking for the last year. I honestly think it needs national leadership. I think it needs national support and national guidance, because I think we'll all get tired trying to fight our own little battles. And when there's protocols which are sent down, you know, the truth is people in infection control need to follow those protocols, otherwise they would be held accountable. So I think we need to go right to the top. We need to ask the NHS to look at this, to bring some sense and sensibility to all of this. You know, I'm not allowed to use reused plastic tubing that I use for de-waxing an ear, even though the plastic tubing is never attached. It's a one-way channel, and I don't know anybody who's died from a wax transplant. But you know, someone once found a tiny virus particle on a bit of plastic tubing, and so I'm not allowed to use it again. I personally would say there's no risk at all with that. Now, if you wanted to put something that's, you know, dirty inside my abdomen, of course there is a risk of that. But we've got this binary outcome. There's a potential risk, therefore we can't do it. And what we need is a measured risk. There's risk in everything we do. If there was no risk, we wouldn't be surgeons. We deal with risk all the time. So we just need to have a sensible approach to risk. And I think that has to come from national leadership. And if I'm honest, we can perhaps have discussions about the role the college could play and other big institutions to try and engender that.
But that needs to be not just the Royal College of Surgeons of England, as you said at the beginning. It needs to work with our sister colleges in terms of trying to drive that forward. So, okay, if we move that one step forward, there's another very interesting question here is, how can we deal with the lack of cleaning facilities? So those sterilization units, those places where we used to wash the gowns and all the rest of it, have all gone. So what should we be putting in place now to bring this back?
So just on that point then, of course, there are sort of three options. People will either have sterilisation services on site or within a given trust, or they will have external contracts off site. And then, of course, there are those areas that don't have access at all. When we actually break down the contribution to the carbon footprint itself, there's actually relatively small additional impacts from that transportation to those off-site centres. So the most important thing is that we are either sterilising or we are linen laundering these reusables. So whether that's locally or regionally, it doesn't make too much difference. The important thing is that we are actually doing it. So for those areas that do not have external contracts in place, then they of course need to be exploring options to put those in place.
So the opposite question has come in, which is great. Could sterilisation of reusable actually lead to more expense and worse carbon footprint? And how should that be monitored?
So hopefully you'll have seen throughout the presentation today, the evidence that I presented actually takes into account the full life cycle assessment in terms of the environmental impact, as well as the full life cycle costing. So that takes into account all stages from raw material extraction through the distribution and the actual use phase, so the sterilisation and the linen laundering, as well as the final disposal. So in terms of the body of evidence, it is suggesting that on both environmental and financial grounds, reusables do come out top.
So is it possible, please, another question, to let us know of further evidence of the non-inferiority of reusable sterile gowns and drapes? Beyond what you've presented, Chantal, is there other papers and reviews that would support that?
The best piece of evidence that I've come across to date is a paper by Overcash et al. That's a systematic review that's actually mainly drawing on LCAs that were developed by industry, but they're very comprehensive. They're tens of pages long, longer, if anything, than what you would typically see in peer-reviewed journal articles. But that would be a good paper to start with. The other piece of evidence would be the life cycle assessment looking at the PPE, which I recently published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And here we included within that single-use gowns versus reusable gowns, again showing clear benefit.
So there's been a lovely comment come in from a colleague working abroad who comments that in Bulgaria, most of the things are reusable and it's working perfectly in that setting. But the feeling is the UK actually has even better systems for decontamination and sterilisation. So there is great encouragement. So I'm going to leave with a final question and just a quick answer from both of you, Mood and Chantal. Sorry, I've lost it there. Where is it? So if we focus only on infection control, then we're only treating the single patient in front of us, but we're ignoring the harm that we're causing to the wider population in terms of plastic pollution and climate change. How do we bring the pendulum back into balance?
So I'm hoping
one sentence.
I'm actually quantifying the disability associated life years, so the damage to human health associated with the use of single use. And I think only then, when we're comparing DALYs, can we actually have a sensible conversation in terms of the risk to human health from the environmental damage that we're causing.
Great, thank you, Chantal. Mood, how do we bring the pendulum back?
What a big question. I think it requires obviously change at multiple levels, including from the politicians, from the infrastructures that we've developed, for example, the sterilisation repair and all of those. But most importantly, it requires leadership from each of us within our workplaces to say, this is something we care about, this is the way forward, this is how we see our future. And it is all of us working on this together.
Thank you very much to you both. Vic, over to you.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, we've had so many questions. We just can't get through them all. Just to wrap up, the questions that keep coming up again and again and again, for those of people that might have missed some of Chantal's presentation, is that they keep saying, but what about the cost of all the re-sterilisation? It has been shown that to re-sterilise, reuse, and not this single-use stuff is the way forward. This is a fact, and this is what is going to be the future. And the industry will need to change. Another quick question came through just saying, what about the fact that the reusable stuff might take longer, and they gave the example of a ligger clip laparoscopically. Well, let me tell you, that's what people used to say, because yes, some things were a bit more clunky and not so easy to use, but there is stuff on the market right now that I have used myself, ligger clips that are reusable, that are no longer like the ones that we've talked about 20 years ago. Laparoscopic ports. There are so many different things. Today I did a hemicolectomy and I'm using 2 different staplers to go across the same piece of bough because it's not licensed for. Anyway, the whole thing's ridiculous. So the onus is going to have to be on industry keeping up and making changes. But what can we do as surgeons? Keeps coming up in these questions, and what we can do is vote with our feet. And actually, we need to go to our departments and ask them, you know, how can we change this? What can we do? I don't want to buy these pieces of equipment anymore. I want to go with companies that aren't greenwashing and the companies that are looking forward and making changes. And we are actually, although we think we're being governed by procurement and the NHS, actually we do also have a lot of power. And I think that we need to remember this, and we need to essentially vote with our feet and think about what we're doing, even down to how we start off that operation in the morning, asking for the drapes to be reusable and not disposable. So there are so many things we can do, and we must do them and start at every level and keep this conversation going, because while this conversation is going, things and changes will happen. But if we don't keep this conversation going, then nothing will change. So there is obviously a lot of appetite for change out there. I'm delighted that there are so many questions and so many people have attended this. I'm also really grateful to Chantel and Mood for doing this. And as we're all on our sustainability and surgery working group committee at the Royal College, this isn't the end of this. You will see more. Chantel keeps producing more and more data for us to publish. We will be providing guidelines, but I can tell you now that single-use items are not the future, and we either need to get on board with that or you'll be left behind. So thank you to everyone here tonight. Thank you to everyone for attending. It's been really interesting, and we will definitely be seeing you again. Thank you.